On the coldest night Ashford Ridge had seen in years, a man in a police uniform walked through a snowstorm behind an abandoned mill and found something the world had already forgotten. A German shepherd puppy sitting inside a rusted cage, not barking, not crying, just waiting as if he still believed someone was coming back. That moment changed everything, not just for the dog, but for the man, for a group of broken children, for veterans who had not spoken in years, and for a whole town that would soon learn what quiet courage really looks like. This is not just a rescue story, it is a story about healing, about staying when it is easier to leave, and about how even winter can be taught how to breathe. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from and leave a comment below. Because tonight this story is for every heart that ever waited in the cold, hoping someone would show up. Ashford Ridge, Montana wore winter the way an old god wears a crown, heavy, merciless, and glittering with the kind of beauty that makes you forget it can kill. On the last week of January, the town sat cupped in the Rockies like a bowl of white ash. Snowdrifts leaned against porches. Power lines hummed under ice. The streets were narrow ribbons of black slush between banks of wind-packed snow, and every street lamp looked like it had been dipped in sugar and sorrow. The forecast on the diner's radio had called it a routine system, which was Montana humor for, "This storm will test your bones." Elias Crow knew storms. He also knew the quieter kind, the ones that arrived without clouds and stayed for years. Elias was 37, built like a man who had spent his life bracing against things. Broad shoulders under a navy parka, hands rough from both cold and duty, jaw shadowed with a day's worth of stubble that never quite became a beard. His hair was dark and clipped short, more habit than vanity, and his eyes, steel gray, tired, watching, had the look of someone who had learned to scan a horizon for trouble and still be surprised when it came from inside. People in Ashford Ridge said he was calm. They meant he didn't raise his voice. They didn't always see that calm was sometimes just grief wearing a uniform. 2 winters ago, he'd lost his wife on a stretch of mountain road that looked harmless until black ice decided to become a judge. Since then, he'd spoken less, smiled rarer, and carried his days like a rucksack with one strap broken still moving, always lopsided. That night, his shift should have ended at midnight. He was already thinking about the drive home, about the quiet cabin on the ridge that waited like a sealed letter, when dispatch cracked through the radio with a call that didn't sound like an emergency at first. Just odd. "Unit 12, you copy?" "Crow," Elias answered, voice low, the way he spoke to keep his own thoughts from overhearing. "We've got a citizen call possible animal neglect, behind the old Hartwell lumber site. Caller says there's a dog, trapped or caged." The words animal neglect floated in the cab like a prayer nobody wanted to say out loud. Dogs went missing in winter. Coyotes got bold. People moved and left things behind. But caged was a sharper word. Elias glanced at the thermometer on his dash. 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Falling. Wind gusts slapped powder snow across the windshield like handfuls of thrown salt. "Any more details?" "Caller is a Mr. Gideon Pike. Says he heard metal, like something banging, and he saw tracks." Gideon Pike was a name Elias knew the way you know a town's old trees. Always there, always watching. Gideon was in his late 60s, wiry as a fence post, with a long face weathered into permanent squint lines and a beard the color of chimney ash. He lived in a trailer near the South Slope, worked odd jobs when his arthritis allowed, and had a reputation for 2 things. He didn't like trouble, and he didn't look away from it. People said he'd become that way after losing a son overseas, quiet grief that hardened into vigilance. Elias flicked on his lights, more to cut through the storm than to announce authority. "Copy. En route." The road to Hartwell Lumber ran past the edge of town where storefront lights fell away and the world turned into dark fields and skeletal cottonwoods. The old mill had been shuttered for nearly a decade, a carcass of industry with broken windows that stared at the mountains like empty eyes. Teenagers tagged the walls in summer. In winter, the place belonged to wind and whatever had nowhere else to go. Elias's tires crunched over frozen gravel as he turned off the county road. His headlights caught a row of rusted equipment, half buried in snow forklifts like abandoned beasts, pallets stacked and leaning like drunken tombstones. At the far end, a thin light bobbed Gideon's flashlight. Gideon stood with his shoulders hunched inside a worn canvas coat, an orange knit cap pulled low, his breath streaming out like smoke from a dragon that had learned to live small. "Officer," he called, voice roughened by cold and disuse. "Glad you came." Elias stepped out and the wind hit him hard enough to make his eyes water. The air smelled like pine sap, old oil, and iron. "Show me." Gideon's flashlight beam jittered over snow and scrap metal as he led Elias along the back side of the warehouse. "I was taking the trash out," Gideon said, "and I heard this, like a chain rattling, not steady, like it gave up and then tried again." He spoke in short sentences, as if long ones cost too much. "At first I thought kids, but there's no laughter. Just quiet." Elias followed the beam to a corner where the building's wall had collapsed inward, creating a sheltered pocket from the worst of the wind. Snow drifted in there anyway, piling like it wanted to bury whatever secrets were stored. Gideon stopped. The flashlight steadied. "There," he said, and his voice did something small and human softened. Elias saw it. Not a proper kennel, not anything you'd buy. A makeshift cage built from warped pallet wood, twisted wire fencing, and a rusted gate that looked like it had been salvaged from a junkyard. It sat half sunk in snow, and for a heartbeat Elias thought it was empty. Then a pair of eyes opened in the darkness inside. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't scramble backward. He sat upright, as if sitting was the last rule of dignity he still owned. He was a German shepherd, puppy black and tan, maybe 7 months old by the length of his legs and the stubbornness of his ears, though one ear slumped slightly, as if it had lost the argument with winter. A faint white streak marked under his chin like a misplaced star. His coat was matted and damp, clumped with ice along his belly. His ribs were visible beneath stretched skin, every breath making his sides pull in too sharply. One hind paw was swollen and the fur around it darkened, like bruising had seeped into the world. Yet his eyes, dark amber, steady held a strange patience. Not fear, not hope, exactly. More like the quiet of someone who has learned the rhythm of disappointment and refuses to spend energy protesting it. "How long?" Elias asked, voice coming out harsher than he meant. Gideon shook his head. "Can't say. I don't come down here much in winter, but the tracks—" He pointed to the snow. Elias crouched, examining the ground near the cage. There were small paw prints packed hard, circling, stopping, circling again, and other marks boots. Older, newer. The story of several visits, none of them kind. The cage door was secured with a cheap padlock, the kind sold in multi-packs. Inside, a torn blanket lay stiff in the corner, frozen into a shape that looked like it had once been soft. A dented canned tuna maybe sat empty. A shallow dish held a slurry of half-frozen water, peppered with dirt and pine needles. The puppy hadn't touched it. "He's been surviving on pride," Gideon murmured, as if embarrassed to say something tender. Elias moved closer. Snow squeaked under his boots. The dog's gaze tracked him, calm but alert. Elias lowered himself to a kneel. In that moment, with the storm crying around them and the warehouse hulking like a dead giant, Elias felt something old in his chest shift, a hinge creaking open. He remembered another winter, another set of eyes, his wife's, laughing through a scarf, cheeks pink from cold, telling him the snow made the world look forgiven. He swallowed. "Hey," he said softly to the dog, using the tone men use when they don't know how to ask permission for mercy. "It's okay." The puppy blinked once, slowly, like a judge considering evidence. Elias slipped off his glove and extended his hand toward the wire, palm open. The air bit at his skin. "I'm not here to hurt you." For a breath, nothing moved. The dog's head tilted slightly, ears shifting, reading him. Then, with painful deliberation, the puppy stood. His back legs trembled, and for an instant Elias saw how thin the line was between standing and falling. The dog took one step, then another, not desperate, not frantic, like he was walking into a room he'd been told was dangerous, but choosing to enter anyway. He pressed his nose against Elias's palm through the wire. Warm, damp, alive. Elias's throat tightened in a way he hated. He had held too many things that were no longer warm. He had signed papers, given condolences. watched the snow erase tire tracks. But this was a living choice. Behind him, Gideon let out a breath that sounded like relief and anger braided together. "You see," he said, "he ain't broken in the head, just worn out." Elias nodded because words were unreliable right then. He stood and examined the lock. Rust chewed at the edges. The padlock looked cheap but stubborn. "You got bolt cutters?" Gideon jerked his chin toward his truck. "In the bed." Elias retrieved them, the metal cold enough to sting through his gloves. When he returned, the dog had sat again, eyes never leaving Elias, as if he believed movement might change the outcome. Elias set the cutters around the lock. The sound of the handles closing echoed sharply in the pocket of the collapsed wall. The puppy flinched, just a fraction more from memory than fear. Elias paused and spoke low, half to the dog, half to the winter itself. "I know. I'm sorry. One more second." He squeezed. The lock snapped with a brittle pop. The gate sagged open like a tired mouth. For a heartbeat, the dog didn't move. He stared at the opening as if it were a trick, as if freedom was just another way to be hurt. Elias didn't reach in. He didn't lunge. He just stepped back and crouched, making his body smaller, his eyes softer. "You can come," he said, "or you can stay while I sit here and freeze with you. I'm good either way." Gideon snorted once, the smallest laugh. "You always talk like that?" "Only to people who don't deserve what happened," Elias replied, then regretted the bitterness except it was true. The puppy's nose twitched. He shifted his weight. And then, with a grace that made Elias want to curse whoever had ever thought a cage was acceptable, the dog stepped forward, one paw at a time, careful with the swollen leg. He crossed the threshold and stood in the open snow, blinking as flakes landed on his eyelashes. He didn't run. He didn't bolt. He just looked up at Elias, waiting for the next instruction the world would give him. Elias shrugged off his parka and draped it around the dog's narrow back like a cloak, a ridiculous little coronation in the ruins of a mill. The puppy leaned into the warmth as if he'd been pretending not to need it. Elias slid an arm under his chest. The dog was shockingly light, ribs like the slats of a broken ladder. He didn't struggle. He didn't make a sound. He simply allowed himself to be lifted, like trust was something he'd decided to try once, just once, before the night ended. Gideon's flashlight beam wobbled as he watched. "What are you gonna do?" Gideon asked, though his eyes said he already knew the answer. Elias held the puppy close against his chest, feeling the slow, steady thump of a heart that refused to quit. "Take him," Elias said. "Get him to Doc Harlow, and then—" He looked down at the dog, at the white streak under his chin, and the old soul patience in his eyes. The storm swirled around them like a choir of impatient ghosts, but the puppy was quiet, present, impossibly composed. Elias felt the shape of a name forming, not yet spoken, like the first line of a prayer. "Then he comes home," Elias finished. The puppy blinked, and for the first time his tail made the smallest movement one cautious sweep, like a candle flame daring to stay lit. Elias turned toward his cruiser, careful with each step on the ice. Behind him, Gideon followed, flashlight steady now, as if the night had finally given him permission to stop shaking. The warehouse faded into the snow behind them, swallowed by white. But Elias knew the truth. Winter never really swallowed anything. It only held it until someone brave enough came looking. As Elias opened the passenger door and settled the puppy onto the seat, he looked at the dog and spoke softly, a promise pinned to the air. "Hang on, kid," he murmured. "Ashford Ridge is cold, but it's not cruel. Not if I can help it." The puppy rested his head against the seat, eyes still on Elias, as if memorizing the face of the man who had opened a door and stayed to prove it was real. The cruiser's heater began to breathe warm air. Outside, the storm kept raging like a myth that didn't want to end. Inside, a different story had begun. And it began exactly where the summary said it would. Beneath a frozen cage, in the arms of a man who had forgotten how to hope, until a silent German shepherd puppy taught him that survival could look like patience, and rescue could look like staying. The storm followed them out of the mill yard, the way guilt follows memory. Snow clawed at the windshield as Elias guided the cruiser back toward the narrow ribbon of highway that cut through Ashford Ridge like a scar. The heater fought bravely, coughing out warm air that smelled faintly of antifreeze and old pine, and the puppy lay curled on the passenger seat beneath Elias's parka, the fabric rising and falling with each careful breath. He had not whimpered. He had not asked. He only watched. Elias stole glances at him between curves in the road. The dog's coat was a battlefield of neglect, black and tan dulled by grime, clotted with ice around the belly and chest, patches of fur rubbed raw at the elbows. One ear stood proud, the other drooped as if it had grown tired of arguing with the world. Under the dome light, Elias could see the faint white streak under the dog's chin, like a smudge of starlight someone forgot to wipe away. "You hang on," Elias murmured, mostly to himself. The words fogged the glass and vanished. When they reached Harlow Veterinary Clinic, the parking lot was empty except for the old Subaru belonging to Dr. Margaret Harlow, mid-50s, silver-haired, tall and lean as a winter birch, a woman whose voice was always gentle and whose hands were always certain. Margaret had been Ashford Ridge's only veterinarian for 30 years, the kind of person who stitched up deer, comforted children, and argued with God in the same afternoon. Her husband had died of a heart attack 10 winters ago, and since then she kept the clinic open longer than she should have because, as she once told Elias, things don't stop needing you just because you're tired. The lights were already on. Margaret opened the door before Elias could knock. She took one look at the bundle in his arms and swore, softly, like a prayer gone crooked. "Bring him in." Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet fur and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Elias set the dog on the exam table while Margaret peeled back the parka and the tattered blanket Gideon had found. The puppy's body was a map of hard days, ribs like broken fence posts, hip bones too sharp, the left hind leg swollen and dark with bruising, small sores along his chest and belly from lying on frozen ground. "How long?" Margaret asked. "Don't know. At least a week, maybe more." She nodded, eyes never leaving the dog. "He's dehydrated, hypothermic, malnourished. We'll warm him slow. Too fast can kill him." She slipped a thermometer under the dog's tail. He didn't protest. He only turned his eyes back to Elias, checking that the world was still in the same place. Margaret drew blood, started fluids, wrapped the swollen leg with practiced tenderness. "No fractures," she said after x-rays, relief threading her voice. "Soft tissue damage. He's lucky. Or stubborn." "Both," Elias said. Margaret's mouth twitched. 7 months, I'd guess. German Shepherd, male. She ran her hand gently between the dog's ears. "You've got a long road, friend." The dog closed his eyes for the first time since Elias had met him. They kept him overnight in a warm kennel with IV fluids and slow nutrition. Elias sat on the floor outside the run long after Margaret went to brew another pot of coffee. He watched the puppy sleep, the way people watch fires when they're afraid of the dark. When Margaret finally insisted he go home, Elias hesitated. "He'll be here," she said, "and you'll be better tomorrow if you sleep." The drive up to Elias's cabin was quieter than the storm, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heart too loud. The house greeted him with its familiar cold, a wood stove in the corner, a coat rack still holding a scarf that was not his, the faint scent of lemon cleaner in memory. Elias stood in the kitchen for a long time before lighting the stove. When he finally slept, it was in the chair by the window, boots on, because beds had been difficult since the accident. By morning, the storm had spent itself. Snow lay thick on the pines, the sky pale as a confession. Elias was back at the clinic before 8. Margaret was already there, scrubbing her hands. "He made it through the night," she said. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They brought the puppy home that afternoon, wrapped in clean blankets, an IV catheter still taped to his foreleg. Elias laid him on the rug by the stove. The dog sank into the warmth like a man who had finally been told it was safe to sit. Margaret knelt beside them. "This isn't a week," she said. "This is months. 3 or 4 for the body, longer for the rest. He's got trauma. That cage," she shook her head. "He's going to have nights. He'll freeze at loud sounds. He'll remember." Elias nodded. "So do I." Margaret looked at him then, really looked, and said nothing more. The first night, the dog did not sleep. He sat facing the door, back straight despite exhaustion, eyes tracking every creak of the cabin. Each time the wind pushed snow from the roof, his body tightened. When Elias reached out, the dog leaned into the hand without turning away from the door, as if guarding something he didn't understand. "Hey," Elias whispered. "It's just us." The dog's breathing slowed, but he did not lie down. It took 3 nights before he slept on his side. In the days that followed, Elias learned the small languages of recovery. He learned to warm broth and pour it slow so the dog would not vomit. He learned to lift the swollen leg with both hands, never twisting. He learned that the dog hated metal. The clink of the stove latch made him flinch. The rattle of keys turned his eyes glassy. Elias moved his keys to a bowl in the bedroom. He wrapped the stove handle in cloth. Neighbors noticed. Clara Whitfield, mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered with a laugh that could push Winter back a few inches, brought over stew and said nothing. Jonah Reeve, the high school janitor, thin and soft-spoken with a crooked smile, plowed Elias's drive without being asked. People in Ashford Ridge had a way of helping that did not bruise pride. By the 3rd week, the dog could walk the length of the porch on his own. His leg remained tender, but the swelling was down. He followed Elias from room to room like a shadow stitched to his heels. He had not barked once. On the 29th day, Elias named him. He was in the kitchen washing dishes when the dog limped in and rested his head against Elias's knee. Elias looked down at the white streak under the dog's chin and thought of the old myths, men who carried the weight of impossible things and kept going. "Atlas," he said. The dog's ear flicked. "Yeah, that's you." That night, a truck backfired on the road below the ridge. Atlas collapsed to the floor, belly flat, breath coming too fast, eyes wide with a place Elias could not reach. Elias slid down beside him, palms open on the wood. "You're here," he said, over and over. "Not there." It took 12 minutes before Atlas lifted his head. Spring did not come quickly. But by the time the icicles on the porch had thinned to needles, Atlas could walk the yard, nose in the snow, discovering the world like it had been waiting. He would stop often, look back to make sure Elias was still there. Elias always was. Winter did not loosen its grip just because Atlas had survived it. In Ashford Ridge, the season only shifted its weight. February bled into March with the patience of a slow animal, and the mountains still ruled the sky like frozen kings. Elias noticed the change first in the way the snow no longer screamed against the windows at night, only whispered, and in how Atlas's breathing grew steadier with each passing dawn. His ribs were still visible, but they no longer cut the air when he moved. His coat began to recover its color, the black deepening, the tan warming, the white streak beneath his chin bright as if some unseen hand had polished it. Yet the wounds inside him did not obey the calendar. Every morning, Elias and Atlas walked the narrow path behind the cabin, where pine needles stabbed through the snow like green promises. Atlas walked slowly, his injured hind leg still stiff but no longer swollen, his head level with Elias's knee. He did not pull the leash, he did not wander. He moved as though the world were a thin bridge and every step mattered, and every 10 or 15 paces he would stop and look back at Elias, not in fear, but in something more careful. Verification. Are you still there? Are we still us? Elias always nodded. Sometimes he spoke. I'm here, buddy. At first, Atlas would only continue after hearing the words. Inside the cabin, the smallest sounds carried their own weather. The click of the kettle, the thud of firewood against the hearth. Elias learned that Atlas stiffened at metal. The scrape of the shovel across the porch boards made Atlas retreat to the corner beside the stove. The jingle of keys could freeze him in place. Elias removed every unnecessary noise from their life. He wrapped the stove latch in cloth. He left his keys in a bowl in the bedroom. He learned to open doors slowly, as if the air itself might break. Still, there were moments the past forced its way back. One afternoon, while Elias was fixing the loose step on the porch, a gust of wind slammed the shed door against its rusted hinge. The sound cracked the air. Atlas dropped flat, belly to the floor, tail tucked tight, his breath racing. His eyes were wide, unfocused, the way eyes become when they fall through time. Elias knelt beside him, not touching, not commanding, just present. You're not there, Elias said, low and steady. You're here. Look at me." Atlas did not look. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to bruise the silence. 12 minutes passed. Elias's knees went numb on the floorboards. Finally, Atlas's ears shifted. His breathing slowed. His gaze lifted and found Elias's face as if returning from a long road. "There you are," Elias whispered. That night, Elias dreamed of his wife, Marianne Crow, 35 when she died, tall and narrow-shouldered, her dark hair always pulled back in a loose knot, a woman who laughed with her whole body and believed, stubbornly, that people could be better than their worst days. In the dream, she was standing in the snow outside the cabin, her breath silver in the moonlight, holding out her hand. When Elias woke, Atlas was sitting beside the bed, watching him. By the 3rd month, Margaret Harlow allowed Elias to begin short trips into town with Atlas. The first was to the post office. The building's door chimed when it opened. Atlas flinched, then steadied himself. Inside, Nora Bell, the postmaster, a compact woman with gray curls and a habit of calling everyone hon, leaned over the counter and smiled. "Well, look at that handsome fellow." Atlas did not move toward her. He did not move away. He stayed at Elias's side, posture tall, ears forward. "He's working," Elias said. Nora nodded, as if she understood exactly what that meant. At the grocery store, a child dropped a basket. The crash echoed off the freezer doors. Atlas startled but did not collapse. He looked up at Elias, searching his face. "Good," Elias said. "You're okay." Each outing became a thread in a larger tapestry of trust. The library, where the turning of pages soothed Atlas's breathing. The gas station, where the scent of oil made his eyes darken, but he kept moving. The hardware store, where the clang of metal made him pause, just for a heartbeat, and then step through it. Healing was not an erasing, it was a learning. One evening in late March, snow began falling again. Not in anger this time, but in wide, soft flakes that turned the town into a storybook. Elias took Atlas to the open field beyond the training yard. He unclipped the leash and stepped back. "Go," he said, gentle. Atlas did not run. He stood sniffing the air, then turned to Elias and waited. "Go on," Elias repeated. "You can." Atlas took a few tentative steps, then stopped again, glancing back. Elias smiled despite the ache in his chest. He had once owned another German shepherd, Orion, larger, older, fearless in the way only experience can make you. Orion had run like the wind the first time Elias freed him in this same field, years before the accident, before everything broke. The memory hurt and warmed him at once. Atlas lowered his head and finally ran. His legs were still thin, his gait imperfect, but he moved with a kind of surprised joy, carving a loose circle around the field before returning to Elias. He stopped directly in front of him and barked once, sharp, loud, alive. Elias laughed out loud, a sound that startled him more than the bark. That night, Atlas slept on the rug by the fire, his body stretched long, his paws twitching in dreams. Elias sat on the couch, watching the rise and fall of his chest, thinking about the shape of a life and how it could change without asking permission. April arrived carrying mud and thin sunlight. With it came the call from Lydia Mercer, director of the Hopewell Community Center, a woman in her early 40s, dark-skinned, composed, her voice always calm, as if she had learned to build peace one sentence at a time. Lydia had heard about Atlas from Margaret and from Nora at the post office, and from Clara Whitfield's stew deliveries, because in Ashford Ridge, stories traveled like weather. "We're starting a small pilot," Lydia said. "Veterans, trauma support, nothing formal, no pressure. I wondered if maybe Atlas could visit." Elias hesitated. Atlas had come far, but the world was large and sharp. "I don't want to break him," Elias said. Lydia paused. Sometimes the broken know how to hold each other. They went the following Tuesday. Hopewell sat at the edge of town in a converted elementary school, its windows bright with hand-painted signs. The room smelled of weak coffee and old carpet and courage. 5 men sat in folding chairs, each carrying a different version of the same silence. One stared at the floor, one stared at the wall, one stared at nothing. Atlas walked in slowly, scanning the room, his movements measured, his presence steady. He did not approach Elias. He did not hide behind him. He moved among the chairs like he was counting heartbeats. He stopped in front of the oldest man in the circle, Harold Quinn, 72, thin as paper, his hands trembling where they rested on his cane. Atlas sat at his feet, not touching, not asking. Harold did not look down. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Harold's hand twitched. His fingers brushed Atlas's head. The room changed. Harold spoke, just a sentence at first, then another. Then a story about a dog in Vietnam that had slept beside his cot and never once left his side. When he finished, he wept. Outside, snow fell softly, as if the sky were learning how to listen. On the drive home, Atlas leaned against the door, watching the road as though it were something he had once lost and found again. Elias kept glancing in the mirror, not to check the road, but to check the dog's eyes. They were clearer now, not healed, but hopeful. Healing, Elias realized, was not the absence of pain. It was the presence of meaning. Spring did not arrive in Ashford Ridge so much as it negotiated. Snow still clung to the north sides of buildings, and the mountains kept their white crowns, but the wind had softened its voice. Elias noticed the change in Atlas first. The dog's coat had thickened, glossy now, the black deep as wet ink, the tan warmed by sunlight that lingered longer each evening. The white streak under his chin shone like a small banner of survival. They kept the rhythm of mornings, slow walks behind the cabin, coffee steaming in Elias's hands, Atlas's breath clouding the dawn. But now, after the walks, they drove into town. The Hopewell Community Center became their second home. The pilot program was small 6 veterans, 1 facilitator, folding chairs, weak coffee, and the kind of quiet that presses on the ribs. Lydia Mercer, the director, greeted them each time at the door. She was 42, slender, posture straight as a ruler, her dark hair always tied neatly at the nape of her neck. People trusted Lydia because she listened with her whole body. She did not interrupt. She did not hurry. She had learned patience the hard way, after losing a brother to addiction and spending a decade working trauma wards where the line between holding someone together and letting them go blurred every day. Atlas entered the room as if he had been there before in another life. He did not rush anyone. He did not cling to Elias. He moved slowly, deliberately, nose sampling the air, ears tuned to the smallest shifts of breath and heartbeat. The veterans barely noticed him at first. Then one of them, Miguel Arroyo, mid-40s, broad-chested with dark eyes and hands that trembled when he tried to hide it, dropped his coffee cup. It shattered. The sound cracked the room. Miguel froze. Atlas stepped toward him and sat. No command, no instruction, just presence. Miguel's breathing slowed, his shoulders lowered. Later, Miguel would say it was the first quiet he had felt in years. Week by week, Atlas became part of the room. He did not perform tricks. He did not seek affection. He chose people the way a compass chooses north. One morning, he settled beside Eleanor Price, 69, widow of a firefighter, her grief so heavy it bent her spine. She laid her hand on Atlas's head and whispered her husband's name into his fur like a secret the world was no longer allowed to hear. Another day, he placed his head on the knee of Thomas Reed, 27, fresh from a war that had taken the color from his voice. Thomas spoke for the first time that morning. The staff watched, careful not to interfere with something they could not replicate. Elias kept notes the way he used to in his K9 days behavior, triggers, recovery time, posture, breathing patterns. Atlas remained sensitive to metal sounds. The clang of a door frame still caused him to pause. But he no longer collapsed. He paused. He breathed. He continued. That mattered. Outside the center, life pressed on. Elias still wore the badge, still answered calls, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer measured days by the absence of pain, but by the presence of purpose. The first setback came on a Tuesday afternoon. They were leaving Hopewell when a delivery truck backfired across the street. The noise struck Atlas like lightning. He dropped instantly, body low, tail tucked, breath racing. People stared. Elias knelt beside him, not touching. "It's not that place," he whispered. "You're here. I'm here." Atlas shook violently. His eyes searched for something that was no longer there. It took 11 minutes before he stood. Elias canceled the rest of the day. They drove home in silence. That night, Atlas paced the hallway, unable to settle. Elias lay on the floor beside him until dawn. Healing, Elias learned, was not a straight road. It was a spiral. Despite the setback, Lydia asked if Atlas would participate in a new expansion, Children's Trauma Outreach. Elias hesitated. Children were loud, sudden, unpredictable. But Atlas surprised him. The classroom at Pinewood Elementary smelled of crayons and glue and nervous hope. 20 small desks, 12 children with stories too heavy for their age. Atlas entered slowly, tail low, ears soft. A girl named Maribel, 9, hair in tight braids, face set like stone, crawled under a table when she saw him. Atlas lay down just outside her reach and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Maribel emerged and wrapped her arms around his neck. No one spoke. Another boy, Lucas, 8, autism spectrum, read aloud from a picture book while Atlas rested his head against the boy's chest, breathing in time with his voice. The words grew steadier. The classroom grew still. Afterward, the teacher wiped tears from her eyes. "He doesn't just help them," she said. "He sees them." That night, Elias removed Atlas's harness and rubbed his ears. "You did good, partner." Atlas leaned his full weight into Elias like the word belonged to him. Not everything was light. Some nights Atlas returned to guarding the front door, sitting alert from midnight until dawn, not waiting for someone to come in, watching to make sure no one left. Elias joined him every time. They sat in silence, 2 sentinels keeping watch over something fragile and new. By early summer, Lydia introduced Elias to Tara Kingsley, the K-9 evaluation supervisor for the region. Tara was 50, weathered, with a scar along her jaw and eyes that missed nothing. She had spent 20 years working dual-purpose dogs overseas before returning home. "He doesn't look like much," Tara said, watching Atlas walk the length of the training floor. "He's not for show," Elias replied. They began preliminary assessments, focus drills, obedience under distraction, noise desensitization. Atlas did not excel. He listened. That was better. When Tara dropped a set of keys behind him without warning, Atlas flinched once. Then he steadied. His eyes returned to Elias. "That's grit," Tara said quietly. Elias smiled for the first time in months. They left early that day. On the drive home, Atlas curled in the back seat like he had earned the right to rest. Elias realized something on that drive. Atlas was no longer just surviving. He was choosing to live. And so, finally, was Elias. Summer reached Ashford Ridge with cautious hands. The snow finally retreated into the highest shadows of the mountains, leaving the valley wet, green, and humming with life. For the first time since Atlas arrived, the world smelled more like pine and river water than frost and metal. The mornings were warmer. The light lingered. But the past, Elias learned, does not care about seasons. They trained at the old municipal K-9 facility outside town, an aging complex of low concrete buildings and chain-link enclosures that smelled of rubber mats, dust, and ambition. Elias had spent years here once, long before grief had hollowed him. The place still carried echoes of that man. Tara Kingsley met them every Wednesday and Saturday. She moved with the quiet authority of someone who had walked through too many storms to bother announcing them. 50 years old, thick gray hair cropped short, scar at her jaw like a memory she had forgiven but not forgotten. Her eyes measured everything. Atlas passed the early drills. Sit, stay, focus under distraction. Children running past the fence, whistles, raised voices. He startled at sudden sounds, but he did not collapse. He returned to Elias. He returned to the task. Progress was not dramatic. It was real. Then came the gate. It was old, rusted, heavy, the same kind of metal Elias had cut months ago behind the Hartwell mill. One heartbeat too still. Elias felt the failure land before Tara spoke. "Hesitation," she said quietly. "Noted." They continued the evaluation, but the moment had already written itself into the day. Atlas finished the course. He obeyed commands. He stayed close. Yet his body carried that single pause like a bruise. When it was over, Tara folded her clipboard. "He has the heart for this," she said, "but heart isn't the same as readiness." Elias nodded. He did not argue. He could not. On the drive home, Atlas lay in the back seat, chin on the door, watching the world pass as if nothing had gone wrong. Elias felt the familiar ache rising in his chest, the same ache he had known at the end with Orion, when the vet's voices grew soft and the room grew too quiet. He missed his exit, kept driving, up the ridge, past the old steel yards, to the bluff overlooking the Monongahela River. He parked at the edge and turned off the engine. "I screwed that up," Elias said aloud. Atlas lifted his head. "I brought the past into that room," Elias continued, "and he carried it for me." Atlas climbed onto the console and pressed his forehead to Elias's chest. Elias broke, not loudly, not with the kind of sobs that scare people, just tears into fur that did not pull away. That night they did not train, they did not review. They sat on the living room floor, sharing chicken scraps and listening to old jazz records Elias had not played since before Marianne's accident. The next morning Elias called Tara. "We want to retake the evaluation," he said. "Not for certification, for closure." There was a pause. Then Tara said, "He can do it, but this time he walks in with no weight on his back, no vest, no commands, just trust." So they trained differently. They went to hardware stores during rush hour. They lay in the middle of parks while kids screamed and bikes flew past. They walked through automatic doors, through narrow hallways, through metal thresholds. Sometimes Atlas froze, sometimes he didn't, but each time the pause grew shorter, and each time Elias forced himself to stay present instead of drifting backward into old grief. By the end of summer, Atlas walked through gates without looking back. The retest came in September. The same course, the same drills, the same rusted gate. It opened. Atlas walked through, no hesitation, no flinch, no memory pulling him apart. Tara smiled and handed Elias the certificate. "He's more than approved," she said. "He's something special." Elias clipped the new blue enamel tag to Atlas's collar. One word engraved in silver: Guardian. Atlas tilted his head and barked once strong, sure, proud. And for the first time since the cage, Elias knew the past had not vanished, but it had finally loosened its grip. Autumn folded itself gently over Ashford Ridge. The mountains loosened their white crowns, the river ran louder, and the mornings carried the smell of damp leaves instead of frost. For the first time since the night of the cage, the world seemed to be breathing in a way Atlas could trust. The guardian tag at his collar caught the light whenever he moved. Elias still reached down sometimes just to touch it, as if to confirm it was real. They did not rush anything after certification. Tara warned him that purpose must grow roots before it grows wings. Elias listened. They started with small visits. 2 veterans at Hopewell, 1 afternoon a week, then 3, then a classroom at Pinewood Elementary, then the Trauma Recovery Center downtown. Atlas chose his places the way the wind chooses where to fall. At Hopewell, he settled beside Miguel Arroyo on the worst days, when Miguel's hands shook too hard to hold his coffee. At Pinewood, he lay beside Maribel, now sitting at her desk instead of under it, and listened while Lucas read whole chapters without stopping. At the hospital, Atlas curled near the patients with the most wires and the fewest visitors, as if he could hear loneliness humming beneath the machines. People began to notice, not in loud ways, in the way they spoke his name softer than before, in the way some of them waited at the door on Thursdays. One evening, Lydia called Elias into her office. The room smelled of old books and lavender cleaner. She folded her hands on the desk. "We're launching something new," she said. "A mentorship program for kids in the system, each child paired with a handler and a therapy animal. Small pilot. We'd like you and Atlas to lead it." Elias looked through the window at Atlas lying in the hallway, head resting on his boots, eyes half closed, listening anyway. "That's a lot to carry," Elias said. Lydia smiled faintly. "He already is." They began the following month. The school doors opened that first morning, and Atlas walked through like he belonged to the building. Not proud, not cautious, simply present. The children were quiet at first, some guarded, some nervous, some wearing anger like armor. Atlas did not approach all of them. He moved slowly, stopped in front of a girl with a notebook full of dark scribbles, and lay down at her feet. She glanced once, then kept drawing. When the session ended, she folded a piece of paper and slipped it into Atlas's vest. Later in the truck, Elias opened it. It read, "He's the first one who looked at me like I wasn't invisible." The weeks formed their own rhythm. Tuesdays and Thursdays at the school, Wednesdays at Hopewell, Fridays at the hospital. Atlas never grew tired of it. He would rest deeply at night, then rise with the dawn like he had somewhere important to be. One Saturday in late October, the community center hosted the Hope Heroes Gathering. Therapy dogs, service animals, volunteers, folding chairs under a park awning, burnt coffee in plastic cups, children in costume, veterans in old jackets stitched with history. Elias almost did not go. Crowds still pressed too hard against his chest. But that morning, when he lifted Atlas's vest from the hook, Atlas sat beside it without being asked. So they went. The parking lot was already half full. People noticed Atlas immediately, not because he was flashy, because he was steady. They pinned a ribbon to his vest, bright blue satin, the words "Companion of Courage" written in careful script. Atlas did not care. Elias did. Later, an elderly man with shaking hands and a cane approached. Walter Bishop, 81, eyes like winter glass. He asked quietly if he could touch the dog. Atlas stepped forward. Walter dropped his cane and fell to his knees, arms wrapped around Atlas's neck, sobbing in the grass. His daughter rushed forward, but Walter raised one trembling hand. "I haven't touched another soul since my wife died," he said. "He let me remember how." Atlas stood perfectly still. That night, Elias sat on the porch with Atlas at his feet, the ribbon fluttering in the wind, the stars slow and patient above them. Winter returned in November, not cruel, not angry, just present. Snow fell the night before their first full day of the mentorship program. By morning, the town was wrapped in white again, softer than before. Elias and Atlas crossed the school parking lot, their footprints the first in fresh powder. Inside, the kids were already waiting. They began with silence. Some days the kids talked, some days they didn't. Atlas never judged which. One boy brought his own puppy one afternoon, ears too big, paws too clumsy. He asked, "Can Atlas teach him how to be brave?" Elias said, "He already is." Atlas licked the puppy's nose once and sat beside him like a mentor in fur. That evening, Elias stood in his living room staring at the empty space above the fireplace. It had been bare since Orion died, since Marianne. He had sworn nothing would hang there again, but he reached for the photo Lydia had sent him. Atlas surrounded by 6 children, all smiling in different directions. He hung it. When winter deepened, the nightmares returned for Atlas, not as often, not as violent, but they came. Some nights he lay by the door again, not waiting, just guarding. Elias joined him every time. They kept watch together. On the coldest night of December, a car backfired in the parking lot after a late hospital visit. The sound cut the air. Atlas dropped, breath racing, eyes gone somewhere Elias could not follow. Elias knelt on the frozen pavement and stayed. Minutes passed. Atlas lifted his head. "You're safe," Elias whispered, "and I'm not leaving." Atlas stood. 2 weeks later at the outreach center, a boy who flinched at every door click whispered to Elias, "Is he scared too?" Elias answered, "Sometimes, but he shows up anyway." The boy nodded, like that made sense. By January, the mentorship program expanded. By February, it was full. By March, people in Ashford Ridge stopped calling Atlas that rescue dog and started calling him our dog. One morning, snow fell so softly it barely touched the ground. Atlas stood in the open field behind the center, the same field where he had first learned to run. He turned to Elias, tail lifting once. Elias laughed, not because life was perfect, not because the past had vanished, but because winter had finally listened. The cage was gone, the door stayed open, and both of them knew what home meant now. Sometimes God does not send a miracle with thunder or fire. Sometimes he sends it in the form of a broken dog and a tired man and a second chance. Atlas did not survive the winter by accident. He survived because God whispered to his heart to keep breathing when everything around him said stop. And Elias found him, not because of luck, but because heaven knew both of them needed each other. In our own lives, we all carry silent cages, pain we never talk about, loss we think no one sees, winters that feel endless. But this story reminds us that God is always working even when the night feels cold and empty. He opens doors, he brings the right souls together, and he turns suffering into purpose. If this story touched your heart, then share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories of healing faith and second chances. May God bless you and your family. May he protect your heart. May He bring light into every dark place of your life. And if you believe in miracles, leave a comment saying, Amen.